I'm joined now by Assemblymember Carmen De La Rosa, who represents the 72nd District in New York City, and that's Hamilton Heights, Inwood, Harlem, Washington Heights, and Manhattan. And I see you're outside right now, and you told me that it's because you were just delivering food. What kind of things are you doing for your constituents? What other kind of things?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And yes, we're outside right now because we just joined NYMIC, Northern Manhattan Improvement Corp, to hand out and distribute food to our community. I think that, representing a minority community of color, a community made up of working class people, the number one need right now has been food access. And so that's been a big part of what we do. We've teamed up not only with NYMIC, but also with Catholic Charities, and we've teamed up with other nonprofit organizations and grassroots group in the community that are actually delivering food, not only to those that are most in need, but to seniors who can't leave their apartments or people who have been sick and vulnerable. I think that it's part of our job as government officials to make sure that we're stepping up, and there's no reason why anyone in our community should go hungry. And so that's been a big part of the work we've been doing. And in addition to that, we've also been working with different people who have been calling our office with unemployment claims. That has been a major part of our constituent services. As you know, 2 million New Yorkers have applied for unemployment since the onset of COVID-19. And so our office has been working diligently to make sure that folks in our community are receiving access to these unemployment benefits that are so needed right now in order for them to pay their rent, pay their utility bills, and put food on the table really for their families. So that's the bulk of the work we've been doing, obviously assisting people with any cases that may come through our community. We set up a remote office. Our phones are all connected to the district office. So anyone that calls our office has someone they can talk to every single day. And we're answering hundreds and hundreds of emails as they come in. But a lot of that work is really on the ground, making sure that our community is fed and taken care of.
You've also been a huge supporter of cancel rent. I know that's so critical and so important for so many people who are struggling to meet the monthly rent bill that's coming in very soon. Talk to me about where that is.
Yeah, last year, Albany had a huge victory that was a people-led victory, and it was the victory to make sure that rent reform happened in New York State. I was proud to be part of that fight. In my district, the 72nd Assembly District, we have the largest number of rent-stabilized tenants in the state of New York. And as someone who has been on the receiving end of an eviction notice, as a child, my parents were blacklisted for having an eviction notice on our door. I know that the struggles of displacement are real in our community. And so I've joined in this time the Housing Justice Coalition as a member of the Housing Committee in the Assembly to make sure that we cancel rents. I think it's not enough to put in a freeze because we know that our communities can't afford the rent, even in regular times. And that we are such at risk for displacement. And so I believe that canceling the rent so that people don't have to go back 3 or 6 months to pay those rent arrears is important. We're working on legislation. We understand the concern of obviously landlords who say, well, we owe the bank money for these investments. And what I think we need to do is come up with a solution where we're bringing tax abatements and other reliefs to the landlord, but with the priority in mind that tenants need to have a home. When we look at the disparities of communities of color, one of the things that has been so unique about why our communities are dying at the rates that they are is because of our housing conditions. We often live doubled up, tripled up, and there is a homeless factor, in my opinion, that exists when you have 3, 4 families that are living in a 1-bedroom, right? Technically, there's members of that family that would be homeless if they didn't have that couch or that family member who gave them a room to sleep in while they go about their lives. And so I think we need to redefine what the tenant movement looks like as far as who are the real homeless people in our community and how do we make sure that we're bringing relief so that displacement doesn't continue to be the norm for these communities. You can't heal from COVID or any other disease if you're sleeping in the train station, as we've seen, or if you're sleeping in the streets, or if you don't have a dignified place to lay your head and actually quarantine and take care of yourself. And so I think that has to be part of the work that we do in Albany, but also the work that we do here locally in the city.
How are you seeing the NYCHA buildings be handled now? Has there been any improvement?
NYCHA is something that's very worrisome. First of all, we know that the capital needs of NYCHA haven't been met. So before the pandemic even broke, we know that there was gross neglect as far as the funding that's coming to our NYCHA buildings, right? We know that money in order to make sure that NYCHA is sanitized, that elevators are clean, that the hallways and the common spaces are clean, that's important. I think that we're starting now to see some improvements. We are hearing from a state-run program and a city-run program where they're going to be sending in folks who are going to go visit NYCHA tenants one by one to offer testing and offer wraparound services. I think that's a good start, but I think that we need to make a more significant investment in the infrastructure of NYCHA, because really NYCHA is our only way to combat some of the displacement that is happening in our communities. Public housing has to be a tool to keep low-income people housed, right? And we need to give value to that tool. And so I think that it's improving, but I think there's so much more work to do when it comes to NYCHA.
So let me ask you, there was recently data that was released by the city about the zip codes that have been affected by COVID, and how you can totally just absolutely see how much more affected neighborhoods that you represent have been hit by this disease. Are you able to communicate with constituents as far as getting testing and getting antibody testing? Have you been able to get people motivated to get to their doctors and get to the testing sites?
Yeah, I think that, you know, when the pandemic hit, we were really slow in rolling out the testing, right? And I think that that was a disservice to a lot of our elderly and our sick, because at this point, you know, what happened was that there was a fear that was instilled in our communities about going to hospitals, about going to go get testing. In my community, we had our first testing site put in about a month into the pandemic, right? So I would say mid to late March. And by that time, we had already seen a great number of deaths. In addition to that, then we later had another test site put in the Inwood section of my district. But still, I think one of the things that I saw was that there were certain pockets of the community that up until today still don't have testing sites. So the inequities that exist in where we're putting these sites, and trying to convince people to leave their homes in order to go and get the testing has been difficult. The antibody testing, getting the information to folks as to where they can get antibody testing. Just yesterday, I heard from the mayor's office, and I'm grateful that this week in Washington Heights and Inwood, they're going to roll out 3 pop-up sites for 1 week each, where people can go and get both the COVID-19 and also the antibody tests. And so I think that that's going to start to make a difference. I also think that we'll see a clearer picture of what those numbers look like. I looked at the maps that you mentioned by zip code, and I saw that in my district, there were areas of my district that didn't have a lot of data. And the number seemed low to me, given what I've seen on the ground. I think that, for example, I saw that parts of my district had higher numbers than others. And then there were parts of my district that when you click on the map, you couldn't see the full picture. You couldn't see what the numbers were. So I think we still have to work on the data transparency portion of it. I'd also love to see a breakdown around the ethnic lines, right? How many Latinos, how many Black? We've seen an overall number, but we haven't seen the breakdown. Yesterday, I actually saw a unique overlay of that map with nail salon workers. And I thought that was so interesting, because when you look at the nail salon industry, you know that those are mostly immigrants, mostly low-income workers. And when you start to think about this data on a broken out set like nail salon workers, it makes you think about, you know, janitors, and it makes you think about maintenance people. It makes you think about educators. How are we breaking down that data to get a full picture of the first responders, the essential workers that have actually been impacted, and who they are? And so I look forward to continuing to work to get more transparency around it. I think we're making great strides, but more needs to be done.
You mentioned, you know, nail salons and those small businesses that really make up your district. Are you seeing them get the access to the PPP loans and the small business loans that has been given out as a stimulus?
Yeah, I think that the PPP program, the first round of it was another failure, to be honest. We saw that a lot of our small businesses that did not have relationships with name brand banks were not able to access the loans. We saw that a lot of the banking institutions that actually have served traditionally communities of color didn't have the ability to break in to what the PPP was. I know there's been a second round and I'm hearing that it's going better for some of our small businesses. When it comes to the economy and reopening, we have to make sure that the regulations that are going to be imposed on our small businesses, for example, sanitary regulations, regulations about social distancing, that our small businesses actually have the tools to be successful. Because, for example, if we say that all employees must wear face coverings and use gloves, how are we expecting businesses that have been closed for months, that are operating right now on deficits, to have enough capital to invest on making sure that there's enough PPE, to make sure that there's enough detergent, that there's enough personnel that is there in order to service our communities properly? We know that a lot of people have tapped into the unemployment networks and are now receiving unemployment. Some people are receiving more unemployment than they did income when they were actually working in some of these low wage jobs. So what happens to that workforce, right? And I think we have to really take a good look at what incentives we're going to have there for our small businesses so that they can operate. And we talked about rents earlier. What's going to happen with our small businesses? You know, a small business in my district pays $30,000 a month in rent. If they've been out of work for 3 months, that's $90,000. Where are they going to get that $90,000 in one shot to be up to date with their rent and not close their doors? So there's much more that needs to happen when it comes to supporting our small businesses.
So another thing that I think is very crucial, especially to an area like Inwood and Washington Heights, is access to the trains. I mean, are you comfortable with how they're dealing with the cleaning of the trains and the the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. shutdown? What's your thoughts on that?
Look, I've always think that mass transit is the lifeline for communities that are working class, right? If you're working class, you don't own a car. You don't have any other way to get to work. I think that the disinfection is necessary, but we need to find a more adequate way to handle that. First of all, I think that it's inhumane for us to go on subway platforms without offering an alternative to the homeless who are living there, to kick them all out at once. I think we have to really send social workers in to deal with the wraparound service substance abuse that exists with this population.
Just a couple more questions. So I understand you're working with advocates to get parolees released who would be eligible, that are non-threatening, and tell me why that's important right now.
So, you know, people, and rightfully so, have made a very huge deal about what's happening in nursing homes, right? Nursing home populations are very vulnerable right now because they're elderly, because they're congregated in settings where they're not able to quarantine on their own. Imagine the situation in our prisons. Here in New York State, we know that the prisons are a hotbed for COVID-19. One of the things that has been very alarming is that we haven't received the data, again, going back to the data points, about how many people have actually died or are sick in our prisons. I think that the community that I represent has been one that has been really impacted by criminal justice and who's arrested. And it's not a coincidence that those same factors are killing people here in our communities on the streets on a daily basis. So you could only imagine those health factors that do exist, cardiac factors, environmental factors, that are the same ones that also exist for our brothers and sisters that are incarcerated. And so we've been working before the pandemic started with an elder parole bill that grants the ability for someone who has served longer than 15 years of their sentence and is over 55 to go before the parole board and be granted a release. If they've shown to transform their lives, if they've shown that they're no longer a danger to society. I really believe in a criminal justice system that is transformative and not necessarily overly punitive. I believe that people are not the sum of their worst mistakes. And so we need to give the opportunity for folks who right now are vulnerable. If we say that our seniors are vulnerable, if we say that people who have heart conditions and asthma and obesity are vulnerable, then those are the same conditions that exist for New Yorkers who are in prison. And those people are our brothers, are our sisters, are our neighbors. And they should also be given the opportunity to not be sentenced to death in New York through COVID-19. And so we're working very hard and diligently, one, to call on the governor to grant clemency to some of these folks that have already been sick with COVID, and two, to look at the elder parole bill and support the mission of granting the ability to go before the parole board and plead their case. If you've served 15 years in prison, statistics show that you are less likely to reoffend. Also, if you're elderly, you're way less likely to reoffend. So this is the population that we're looking at and that we hope to have some resolution for in the coming days.
Assemblymember Carmen De La Rosa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the time and for the platform, and I hope you and your family are well.